I put up a video last week entitled Alan Watts's Opinion on Christianity, where I argued against Alan Watts's opinions on Jesus in the Gospels. What I didn't know is I labeled that video made for kids when I was putting it up and didn't find out until after the weekend. So naturally I didn't, I think I got 30 views. So in this video, I want to go over the information I provided. It was very good information if you like apologetics, and this will give you a much better understanding of New Testament writings. I'll start off with this statement, and many of you have probably heard me make this statement. The statement is, the New Testament was written by Catholics for Catholics. There are literally millions upon millions of people that somehow believe that gospel writers were journalists documenting a historical count of Jesus's ministry. They're under the impression that gospel writers and the early church were two separate entities. There was this Christian movement sweeping through Syria and Turkey, Macedonia, Athens, up into Rome. And then, oh, by the way, there was also these journalists who were blogging about Jesus's ministry, and they had nothing to do with the early church. It's a strange way to think about the Bible because so many of the New Testament writings were written to specific churches. You know, all Paul's letters to the Galatians, the Ephesians, the Corinthians, the Romans, and then even John, writing Revelation, writes to the 7 churches. So when it comes to the letters, yeah, those were for specific people. And then there's some disconnect when people think of the gospel writers to believe that no, they were writing for a general public for all to read. Once you understand this concept that gospel writers were writing for specific churches or specific communities, so much more of the New Testament will come into focus for you. For example, why do we have 4 different gospels giving different information, such as the birth narrative and different sayings of Jesus and different events? And the reason is simple. It's because those 4 different gospel writers were writing for their specific churches and communities. So most people know that Luke and Acts was written for a Gentile community. And most scholars believe this Theophilus, of who he's writing to, is the bishop of that community. Maybe it's Antioch, we don't know. And then when Matthew writes his gospel, he's writing for Jewish converts in his community. Most biblical scholars will tell you that Matthew's a very Jewish oriented gospel. If you're a Roman soldier in the Roman Greco world, a Gentile, and you get a copy of Matthew that starts off with a genealogy, the first question you're asked is, who the hell are all these people? This makes no sense to me, and I care very little about it. If you're located in Alexandria and you're a Gentile, and you get a copy of Mark's gospel, that's missing the ending. Most of you know Mark's gospel ends at, I believe, verse 8, when the women run away from the tomb screaming. If you're a Gentile reading that, you have no idea what happened to Jesus, and I guess the first thing you're thinking is someone must have stole his body. But the people in Mark's community, they understood what happened to Jesus because the disciples had already told them orally what happened at the end of Mark's gospel. Later on, someone would add the ending to Mark's gospel, believed to be in the 8th century. Here's something for you. Do you know that there is an argument, a debate among Protestant biblical scholars and Paul's pastoral letters. Those are 1st and 2nd Timothy and the letter to Titus. The Protestant scholars do not like those 3 letters. They don't believe they are divinely inspired. They don't believe they were written by Paul. And the reasoning behind this is because they say those pastoral letters show too much bias towards the Catholic Church and the organization of the early church. They believe that those letters were written after the turn of the century, somewhere around 110 to 120 AD or CE Common Era, not during the life of Paul. And you know what I say to those biblical scholars? I say you're right. Those writings are biased because all the 27 books of the New Testament are biased towards the new early Christian church. Do you see the irony here of the pastoral argument? It's exactly what I described in the beginning of this video. To claim that those 3 letters are too biased towards the Catholic Church is in complete denial of the rest of the 27 other books in the New Testament. Those biblical scholars are under this impression or idea that gospel writers were historical writers writing for a general audience and documenting the accounts of Jesus of Nazareth during his ministry. I'm telling you if you ever get into a debate about Catholicism in certain passages in the New Testament, have the person, whoever you're debating with, to take into account the author and the audience of the writing. Let me give you an example. So many people out there believe that the Eucharist discourse found in the Gospel of John, chapter 6, is describing a spiritual experience of manna that gives you life forever, and not the actual body and blood, not the actual Eucharist. Now, let's take author and audience into account for John's Gospel. The author, whoever that author may be, we believe it is John, but it could be someone else. Did the author of John practice Eucharist? We have a very good indication that he did, because Paul, in his letters, tells us in the Corinthians that the early churches were practicing Eucharist. So it seems highly likely that the author of John's Gospel was practicing Eucharist. How about his audience? Well, his audience is not a general audience. Notice that he talks about manna. How would a general audience know what the heck manna is? How would a Gentile, how would someone in Athens get the reference back to Exodus of manna from heaven? John is writing to a specific audience that understands the Old Testament and how it relates to Eucharist. So John's audience was most likely practicing Eucharist, and which is why John devoted a whole chapter towards the Eucharist, because the early church, we know, was practicing Eucharist. In summary, all 27 books of the New Testament were written by Catholics for Catholics. Now, some people have a problem with the term Catholic and Christian, but I use the term Catholic because that term came out at the turn of the century in Ignatius's 7 letters to the churches of Smyrna and I believe it's Philadelphia, and the one in Rome telling him not to kill him. Anyway, again, he's writing to churches again, and he's using the word Catholic. So we understand that word he didn't make that word up. That term universal came in the 1st century. He just used it in one of his writings. So, in conclusion, I would say, if you lose any idea that gospel writers were reporters, journalists, bloggers, they were writing for a general audience, because that is inaccurate. And I'm not saying that gospel writers were not divinely inspired. They can be both. They can both be writing to their specific audience or communities and also be divinely inspired. So I appreciate you watching this video. If you care to like or subscribe, go ahead and do that. I have several plans for what I'm going to be putting up. This series I'm going to be putting up in the fall, but I'll cross that bridge later. See ya.